Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Hello again, Paul Barter here, and today I'm talking with Sara Stace from Sydney in Australia about an unsung parking reform success story in Waverley Council area, which is in Sydney's inner east between central Sydney and the beach. Before I introduce her, I want to explain briefly why I asked Sara onto the show. In early June 2021, Sara replied to a Twitter conversation among some Australian planning and transport professionals about parking by mentioning that in 2018, Waverley had set all of its minimum parking requirements to 0, and they even introduced parking maximums. I was surprised because I knew that city centres in Australia often have parking maximums and 0 minimums, but I had no idea that a whole local government in Australia that was not a central business district had actually abolished its parking minimums. So, of course, I hopped on and did a web search, and I was puzzled that I had trouble finding any news about this reform. I couldn't find much public controversy. I couldn't find evidence of a big fuss. Maybe I was searching ineptly, or did Waverley somehow know something that the rest of us should learn on how to get this kind of a reform through, a reform that so many other cities find difficult and controversial. So what's the secret sauce? So of course, I reached out to Sara and we planned this interview. So Sara and I will be talking about just one small episode in her career, which is her 3 and a bit years stint at the Waverley Council. And when she was there, she was a key force behind Waverley's People, Movement and Places strategy, which is the council's ambitious plan to prioritise walking, cycling, public transport and shared mobility. But Sara has an award-winning and much published career as a city shaper, strategic thinker and innovator on cities, land use and urban transport in many, many roles over a 24-year career so far. Most recently, Sara worked in the State Government of New South Wales, where she was Associate Director for Walking and Cycling Strategy. And we may touch on some of her experience in that role as well. And she's just recently begun a new position as Director of Cities with the consulting firm WSP. So welcome to the Reinventing Parking podcast, Sara.
Great. Thank you for having me on the show, Paul.
No worries. It's a privilege. Finding a case of abolishing parking minimums without too much fuss is really quite an interesting and intriguing puzzle for me. Maybe just before we get into that, I should ask you to paint us a little bit of a picture of Waverley for people who may not be familiar with Sydney. Is it fertile ground for parking reform?
So, yes, Waverley Council is a very small local government area. Waverley Council basically covers Bondi Beach, as you mentioned, through to Bondi Junction, where there's a major train station. And it's about 9 square kilometres. I can't recall the population off the top of my head. It would be in the order of around 150,000 people. There's a lot of tourism to Bondi Beach from the Sydney CBD that's only about 7 kilometres away. And they tend to travel there by hopping on the train, and then they hop off at Bondi Junction, and they usually then catch the bus or might walk or cycle down to the beach. But there's a very high transport movement between Bondi Beach and Bondi Junction as both a tourist destination and to link between the residential and employment areas.
Okay. And which era in history was most of the area built up in?
Bondi Beach area was probably developed mostly in the sort of 1920s to 1930s. So there is a fair bit of Art Deco. It's almost got, some buildings almost got a Miami Beach style to them. Usually sort of 2-story walk-ups up to about a 6 or 7-story development in the Bondi Beach area. Mm-hmm. Bondi Junction is much more developed than that in the central core around the train station. So you've got these trains that come in off the Sydney core central business district, and it's about 4 stops from the central station to get to Bondi Junction station, and it's quite high development around there, high density residential and commercial.
Okay. For listeners internationally, I guess you'd say it's the wider context of Sydney is it's a fairly car-dependent metropolitan area, but this is part of the older inner suburban areas that were transit-oriented 100 years ago.
It's relatively dense. So in fact, interestingly, although it is a lot of what we would call medium density, because it's fairly uniform 2 to 3 story walk-ups, usually apartment blocks or Art Deco buildings, what we call semi-detached, where you'll have 2 houses adjoining each other with a single shared wall. It's actually pretty high density. It's as high density as you'll often get in what we'll call high-rise development areas, because you don't have a sea of car parking around that.
So now I guess we need to perhaps go back. Where does the story start?
A DCP from around about 1994.
Right, DCP is Development Control Plan.
Correct. A development control plan is the planning instrument that local governments have to control all development in their local area. So Waverley Council in 1994 put in a development control plan, and that control plan had a fairly low provision of car parking requirement in it. So the car parking provision rates were largely unchanged between 1994 and 2012.
And they were fairly traditional, but not very high ones by Australian standards.
Yes, my understanding is, I will need to double check this fact, but my understanding is that there was a zero minimum requirement in the Bondi Junction area. Mm-hmm. That's sort of within about an 800 metre walking distance of the train station. The train station was only built in the late 1970s. So all of this development sprang up around that new station at Bondi Junction, but it had a zero minimum.
This is Paul a few days after our interview. As Sarah mentioned, she needed to double check some facts there, and we did that together and dug out some of those older pieces of information. And it turns out that Bondi Junction and the whole of Waverley had fairly conventional parking minimums between 1994 and 2004. But then from 2004 until July 2013, the minimums were lowered and maximums were introduced for residential land uses for the first time. So the result was that in Bondi Junction, there were indeed very low parking minimums for the medium and high density residential uses and moderate maximums for those uses. And there were also reduced but not zero minimums for the other non-residential uses. So it's true that Bondi Junction had progressive parking policy, but it wasn't zero minimums. And I should add that everything that Sarah says about the events from 2012, 2013 does seem to be accurate as far as we can tell, digging into all of the complicated details of the development control plans. So now back to the interview.
I do have a copy of the 2012 development control plan, and in that it has, in front of me here, Bondi Junction had a minimum of zero car parking requirements for all developments, and then it had a capped maximum. So, for example, a 1-bedroom unit might be a 0.6 parking spaces per bedroom, and then it had a capped maximum for office and for retail as well.
Okay, so at least for that particular very transit-oriented location, the council was already fairly progressive with its parking approach.
That's right. And then they basically divided up. So it's as I mentioned, it's only about 9 square kilometres for the whole local government area. And they had 4 different parking zone areas. So there was one for Bondi Junction, which had this zero minimum and a capped maximum that was fairly low. Then they had another car parking zone A around Bondi Beach area, which also had a very low, in fact, the same zero minimum and capped maximum for residential and a very slightly higher requirement for business and retail.
Interesting. Okay.
Then they had for an area called Dover Heights, which is further to the north. They had a relatively high minimum parking requirement for residential and a fairly high capped maximum. And then they had something that was like a lukewarm in between in the Bronte area. So parking controls have been in place on an area basis for around about 20 years in these locations. And what we then have, I compared that spatial car parking provision requirements against the census data, which is undertaken every 5 years Australia-wide. And the census question asks how many motor vehicles are owned in that household. And so I've compared that census collection data with the RMS, which is the Roads and Maritime Service vehicle registration data. So I've got two different data sources to try and compare the evidence of vehicle ownership against this policy that's been in place for many years. And what I found was that in Bondi Junction, where they had a low capped maximum, there was no growth in vehicle ownership over a period from 1996 through to 2016, which is when we have our last census data.
That's a period in which there was a lot of apartment building in that area, a lot of new population. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. There was a huge amount of development in the Bondi Junction area around the train station during that time. They've built a major shopping centre and done a lot of major apartment buildings in that area as well.
Okay.
So what we find is that where there was that capped maximum, there was no growth. So the average vehicle ownership per household was 0.78 cars per house in 1996. And it was exactly the same as that in 2011 and 2016. So we see no growth at all in vehicle ownership per household. And then when I've compared that against the vehicle registration data that's for which includes businesses as well, there's also been little to no growth. And then when you look at Dover Heights, where there was a minimum of 0.5 cars per one-bedroom apartment, right up to at least one car per household for a three-bedroom apartment or house as a minimum, and very high capped maximum, that actually had higher car ownership growth than even the entire of Greater Sydney average. So you've got this really tiny local government area where the location that had a low capped maximum had no growth in vehicle ownership.
Yes.
The part of the municipality that had high parking requirements had very high growth in car ownership. And then the one that was in between on its parking controls had an in-between car ownership growth.
So that is striking. Did you collect that evidence while you were at council? Did this play a role in the debate within council?
Yes, absolutely. So this was collecting the data to show to the councillors and that we had collected the evidence around what we'd done in the past to do with parking provisions to then try and guide any future changes to those parking requirements for new developments. It was part of the Waverley's People Movement and Places documentation. So we were looking at data across a whole lot of different aspects of movement within the Waverley Council area because we wanted to understand how people are moving around today, whether that was on foot or public transport or by car, to then come up with what's our policy direction and community aspiration for the next 10 years.
I think you mentioned that there was some reverse movement on parking minimums for a few years just prior to this. They were reinstated, the minimums in certain areas. Yeah,
so I think possibly around 2015 or 16, there was a change to the DCP that removed the 4 zones. I think in 2016, the 4 zones were removed and changed to just 2 zones. And so it took us a couple of years to just consolidate that into a renewed direction. But then in 2016, we changed that again just to clarify that. And so if you look at the development control plan today, there is very clearly 2 different zones for the parking controls in Waverley Council. So there's within 800 metres walk of the major train station, and then there's the rest of the local government area. When I look at that parking zone 1, which is around the Bondi Junction station, there is a 0 minimum requirement for residential as well as for business and office premises and retail premises. And there are capped maximums on that. And then pretty similar, just a very slightly higher capped maximum for outside of that central business area, but there's still a minimum 0. And then there's also requirements for there to be car share bays provided, accessible parking spaces for, as well as electric bicycle charging and electric vehicle charging requirements all in that control plan.
Right. Yes. So it's very impressive. So, okay. So that backtracking was perhaps an administrative glitch rather than a response to a backlash against zero parking minimums.
Correct. As far as my understanding is.
Interesting. Okay. And as far as you're aware, there hasn't been a backlash?
No, I think with People Movement Places, which is the 10-year strategy for the council around all of its movement in the area, the questions that were asked of the community is, what are the types of things that we want to change or do as part of our community? And there was a very strong support from the community. They want to have good quality walking and cycling access. They want to continue to have good public transport, and they are very well served by public transport with both the train and around about 30 different bus routes all within that local government area. Those buses and trains are provided by the state government, but nonetheless, the community is very, very well served by public transport.
Okay.
And then they certainly put parking. It's a contentious issue. It always is contentious for the community. We put it forward as, what do you want your lifestyle and community to be like? And they came back saying they really want to have great walking, cycling and public transport. The feedback we did get back, though, was that people are very strongly supportive of car share. And so that was probably our biggest bit of feedback around parking, was They said that we'd had always been very progressive at the council about providing car share bays, but had not put in any recently up until that point of time for the last couple of years. And so the council responded by immediately getting through more car share bays to allow people to access that shared mobility option.
Okay. Perhaps could we get a little bit of background about the politics of the local area, just so people understand?
In Waverley Council area, they've got a combination of independents, Labor, Liberal and Greens, but it's fairly closely balanced. I prefer not to comment on the politics of local government areas, but they do have a fairly balanced between the Greens, the Labor and the Liberal on that local council.
This proposal to set the minimums to zero across the whole area was not a very prominent part of this much larger strategy document, which has 12 or more chapters on various issues, and it's a very upbeat, positive, and optimistic kind of a document. There's a parking chapter which has quite a long list of possible parking initiatives, and just one of them is reinstate zero minimums and capped maximums in the DCP. So in a way, it was fortuitous that they had been dropped just prior to that, because then you can say reinstate them, which doesn't sound very threatening, does it?
Well, certainly the evidence had showed that it had worked very clearly in the past. In the council's broader aspiration around transport is that they don't want to have a lot of traffic going through the area. I think also, given that Bondi Beach is an extremely popular destination, both locally and regionally, and obviously overseas visitors as well, that they are plagued by a lot of people wanting to come down to the beach by car. And there's a lot of other options to catch public transport. It's easy to get there from lots of different parts of Sydney to the beach. And so I guess part of the aspiration for the local communities, they don't want to be swamped by cars driving round and round in circles looking for parking. So how do you solve that problem? Do you provide more parking, to which there's probably a completely insatiable demand? If you've got 50,000 people on the beach, obviously pre-COVID, on a midsummer's day, and you've only got about 1,200 car parking bays, there's absolutely no way those people could have gotten to the beach by driving and parking.
Yes.
And you can't meet that level of demand. That has to be met through really good public transport, and then getting local people to be able to walk and cycle. And when we asked them in that transport strategy, we went out to at least 30,000 people, saw that. It went out on the mainstream media for television. We had intercept surveys on the street where we asked people. So we looked at all sorts of different ways of engaging people, both online and in person. And the overwhelming response was that people locally, at least, would want to walk or cycle to the beach or to Bondi Junction, or catch the bus. They didn't want to have to be forced to have to drive and look for parking and so on.
Yes.
There are concessions for people who live locally. They can get free or very discounted car parking permits to be able to park on their street. But they overwhelmingly said they want there to be some form of parking control, in part because they don't want people travelling from outside and parking outside their house or outside their business.
Yeah, so it's interesting. People have a long experience, it seems, of relatively successful parking management. And so the sort of conventional wisdom in this part of Sydney is that parking management is necessary. It may not be that much fun, but it does its job, and you can rely on it to make sure you don't have nuisance parking and that things work reasonably well. One contrast that strikes me with this story compared to many other efforts to abolish parking minimums in other places, very often there's been a campaign, maybe by some sort of coalition of green transport or sustainable transport folks, pushing specifically to abolish parking minimums. So, for example, in Auckland, there was a campaign, bin the mins, bin the minimums. In Waverley, there was never really that kind of a campaign, and the effort to do this reform was just part of a big positive reform. It was just one among many things that was done, and there was no particular fuss. Would that be roughly correct?
Yes, that's right. But probably, I think it was supported by property developers in the area. The property developers who are doing new developments, there's not a lot of new development, but where it does occur, you've got very sophisticated property development market, and they understand that the local community isn't necessarily seeking to have lots of parking. If you've got the average for the entire local government area is only around just over one car per household, compared to about 1.5 cars per household for the whole of Greater Sydney. People don't travel as far. There's only sort of around 10.8 kilometres a day travelled per person, compared to 17, 18 kilometres a day in Greater Sydney. So there's a recognition by the community and by, say, property developers that, in fact, it's not important to have a car when you live in that local area. In this type of area, it can add around about $200,000 to the cost of buying an apartment or a house just to have a single off-street parking bay attached to it. So when you're talking about housing affordability, that attachment of or requirement for a parking space to be part of your unit purchase or rental is pretty onerous to expect. And when people aren't using them, it's people don't necessarily want to have that.
Right.
And if you're living in a place like this, that it is very walkable and there are a lot of options for public transport and cycling and walking, then it's questionable as to why you would need to have policies that require parking for all new developments.
Yeah. So I'm still thinking about like this mystery of why was there no enormous fuss when people heard that the parking minimums would be zero. Maybe not in Bondi Junction or Bondi Beach, but in the other areas where maybe you would expect to have some perhaps backlash against infill development, some NIMBYs. Maybe the parking minimums are seen as a way to keep the parking for them in their own streets. Was there any of that kind of the usual kind of arguments that happen around abolishing parking mandates?
It's certainly not that I'm aware of. And there have been multiple opportunities for that to occur. So there was both the, as we talked about before, the people movement and places strategy for transport overall. And then there's also been community consultation for the broader, every 4 years they have to go out to the whole community. So they have a community strategic plan every 4 years. And in that, the council set out where their budget's going to be spent, what their broader community aspirations are, and so on. And that has to follow through to their operational plan. So that's very publicly available and goes to the whole community for consultation. And it was mentioned in there. And then they also have, when they do changes to the development control plans, that also has to go through a community consultation and approval process. So there have been multiple opportunities. If there was a huge backlash from the community, there would have been multiple opportunities for that to get feedback. And we did not get a huge amount of feedback from the community in response to that.
Okay.
But the main one we heard was we want to have more cycleways. And so there are cycleways under construction right now, as well as some pop-ups in the local area in response to COVID. And so that's where the concentration has gone, or along Bronte Cutting, which is next to one of our beaches. That had a 3-year trial to take out on-street parking, and that's now become a permanent footpath.
Right.
So I think the communities just said their aspirations were elsewhere.
Right. It's very encouraging. And it sounds as though we can put aside one hypothesis, and this is like perhaps a conspiracy theory hypothesis. It's clear that this wasn't kind of somehow someone in council said, "Mwahaha, let's sneak this through by keeping it a secret and not telling anyone." It was no secret, but it was part of a broadly reassuring and positive package of changes. So even if we only look at the parking changes, we see a whole bunch of interconnected strategies that would have reassured anyone who was worried about, say, parking shortages, that there was lots of things being done that would alleviate parking problems in ways that were not going to be too painful for them. And so having zero minimums was no big deal in the wider context of all of that. Does that sound about right?
Exactly right. That's exactly the approach that we took. We don't want to concentrate on, although one of the problems is, what do we do for new developments? How do we limit traffic or the impact of traffic on our local area? And the answer was not to then concentrate on solving traffic problems. The answer was, well, let's look at how we can find alternatives and other options for people, because this is what they're asking for.
Right.
When we went out to community consultation, they were very clear. We want better footpaths. We want better walking access. We want to be able to catch the bus and get to the train station, walk to the beach or cycle to the beach. And so that's what we then concentrated our efforts on. I will say that in around about 2018, there was a very big community consultation around changes to charging for parking. So looking at whether or not we sort of provide cheaper or free rates for residents to park at the local beach, changes to I think it's well over $7 per hour to park at the beach if you're not a local resident. They looked at all sorts of different aspects around charging. And so again, this is very open and transparent to the whole community to be able to give feedback on. And even at that point, there was no sort of major pushback to say we need to change the off-street parking requirements for new developments. So it's been transparent. It's been out in the public.
I seem to remember that this area, especially around Bondi Junction, has a long history of quite vigorous on-street parking management, including parking fees. I visited the area many times over the years, but I remember once in particular when I was first getting interested in parking, I took note, I think it was around 2010 perhaps, that parking fees were different in different streets around Bondi Junction. There was a very expensive area and a less expensive, and then very cheap and then free, something like that. So there's experience in council with effective setting of parking prices in order to get about the right level of usage. Is that your impression as well?
Yes, I think so. The council has certainly, in part possibly because Bondi Beach has had to be extremely well managed around parking.
So I was mentioning Bondi Junction, but yes, Bondi Beach even more so. That's right.
That's right. And so I guess they've probably got good experience with trying to manage that. And then obviously you've got a major train station, which is the only train station in the eastern suburbs area other than King's Cross, that they've then needed to manage parking related to that as well. So I'd say they're progressive. They're also currently doing a whole lot of work around pick up and drop off, so PUDO bays, to try and look at sort of digital curbside management and using different journey planning apps, innovation and so on. That might be the subject of another podcast, but I do think for their on-street parking is certainly complementary to their off-street parking management policies.
It sounds like including these reforms in a major strategy is a good strategy if you want to get something that could potentially be a bit controversial if it was a standalone reform. But if it's part of a wider attractive strategy, it's more likely to have a constructive discussion. And But on the other hand, inevitably there are specific changes, like you mentioned, various bike paths, the cut, etc., and specific real estate developments that maybe neighbours nearby are worried about the parking and worried about loss of parking for bike lanes, etc. That's where things get a bit different. The debate is often less constructive. Have you had people sort of screaming out, put back the parking minimums in response to sort of certain local area problems?
Not that I'm aware of. So certainly the community's broader aspiration is, and I think this is not specific to the Bondi area, this would be right across Australia and probably globally, where broadly, we'd love to have a lifestyle where we can walk more often to things or walk to school and walk to the shops. But then when the crunch time comes and it means that a business is going to lose the parking spot right outside the front of their shop because we're putting in a wider footpath or a cycleway, then we'll have a different reaction.
Yes.
Because it now actually means something other than just this broader aspiration that everyone will be able to just walk whenever they want to. So yes. I think that's, and I don't think that's unique to any particular location. That's a global phenomenon.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So do you have any parking related insights or suggestions about this surge of protected bicycle lanes that's been happening in Sydney? And this might be in part from your experience with Waverley Council and also in your recent role in the New South Wales government.
Yes, so recently I've been working on doing the pop-up cycleways in response to COVID. We came up with a very big program. One of them was run through the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, which was a Streets as Shared Spaces program. So that was a $15 million program as grants to councils. I think we had close to 70 councils across regional New South Wales and in Sydney that got funding to put in things like parklets. So take out a car parking bay and put in an Onstreet parklet where you can sit and dine, as well as putting in pop-up cycleways that have gone through on Oxford Street in the city is about to be built. We've put some in Moore Park Road and other locations through the inner parts of Sydney. Some components of that where people have been found that they did not have an alternative to park outside the front of their house, particularly for disability access, has had a lot of feedback from the local community. And so we've looked at ways to try and mitigate that through finding other options or giving them disabled access in other spots.
Okay.
But largely, my understanding is that you'll tend to get a big impact or response within the first 3 or 4 months. But then after a while, people get used to it and they'll tend to focus their attentions elsewhere.
Yeah.
But also we looked at the fact that not all on-street parking is equal. So
yes.
A loading bay to a business is probably of a higher order priority to try and maintain or replace in some way, whereas all-day parking that's unmetered parking is probably of lower value, and that's probably proven by the fact that you allow all-day parking with no restriction or no charging on that.
Okay, yeah. And it's interesting that this must be viewed as a success within government because it's encouraged the New South Wales government to actually institutionalise a different set of priorities for the use of on-street space, including the curb space just recently, hasn't it?
Yeah, so they released a new corporate policy by Transport for New South Wales called the Road User Space Allocation Policy. It's part of a broader move by the New South Wales government to have a movement and place approach. I think that's a fairly, that's being used. Sometimes it's called link and place. Sometimes it's called movement and place. We're seeing a lot of Australian state governments as well as the New Zealand government take a strong interest in a movement and place approach where you're trying to balance a road or a street corridor for both its moving lots of sort of vehicles or goods through versus the place approach. And so as part of that, we, Transport for New South Wales put out a corporate policy that said all projects that involve a street space need to think about how they're balancing the use of that road space for public transport or wider footpaths, bus stops, on-demand transport and so on, it may not always be for on-street parking or the movement of motor vehicles through that space.
Okay, that's fascinating and very encouraging. And all of this, surprisingly enough, people might be surprised, this is taking place under a state government that is right of centre. Some people may not expect this kind of thing from a right of centre government, but it is happening.
That's correct.
Just one last thing about the bicycle lanes. I'm again trying to dig a little bit to find tips for others in other countries and other cities if they're faced with these parking related battles over bus lanes, tram lanes, bicycle lanes. And one hypothesis, the experience of Seville in Spain, I have a thing called the Parking Reform Atlas, and I highlighted Seville as a case study there recently. And one of the ideas of why they were able to be successful was that they did a very rapid rollout of a whole network. They managed to create quite a useful network very, very quickly. And everyone could see that any arguments about any particular stretch of street were not just about that street. They were about the whole network. And the emphasis was then on, okay, we're going to create this network. The question is how, not whether we do it. And so then that changed the nature of the debate about each particular street. Now, is there any similar dynamic in Sydney where there's been quite a rapid rollout of bike network?
Yes, traditionally in the New South Wales context, I can't comment on other parts of Australia, but I think it's probably fairly similar. It can take an incredibly long time to roll out the cycleway network. The experience of a lot of local governments trying to work with the state government and all the various players in the space of streets is that putting in a cycleway can take anywhere between sort of an 8 to 10 year period just for a single stretch of cycleway. It tends to create a lot of, we need to get it exactly right and solve all of the problems before we can put even a sticker down on the ground.
Right.
During COVID, when we pivoted all of that to say the most important thing for us is to create more space for people and create the ability for people to cycle instead of driving or using public transport, we rolled out about 28 kilometres of pop-up cycleways in about 10 councils in New South Wales. And they were particularly concentrated around the City of Sydney area, where we put in close to 10 kilometres of pop-up cycleways very rapidly.
Okay.
And that's had enabled around about 15,000 additional trips a week by bicycle. So we've had over 700,000 people ride on those or trips done on those pop-up cycleways in 12 months alone. And that has meant that we've had to take away some parking, or we've had to deal with that. But I think one of the great things about taking that sort of temporary or pop-up approach to putting in cycleways or wider footpaths is that you get to test this with the community. It's no longer just a plan on a document, on a PDF,
right,
on a website somewhere. It's actually right in front of you. And you can then test and consult with the community about, well, what aspects of this work and what aspects don't work? Do we need to find alternatives? But you don't have to get it 100% right on day one. And it means that you can much more rapidly roll out the network and demonstrate that there's the uptake. And one of the big surprises for us was Pitt Street in Sydney CBD, which has had a massive growth in people cycling along there, even though it's not fully connected to the rest of the network. And whilst we've had, the CBD has been very quiet due to COVID lockdowns and restrictions, but it's also allowed more people to walk on that street as well. So we've kept loading zones and bus priority where required, but we've taken out the on-street parking for general car parking. And I think that's been a really important and valuable lesson for us to see that,
right,
and see the evaluation of whether or not that's worked.
Yeah, so two lessons. Quick rollout is helpful, but perhaps even more important, the point you made was using a trial or pilot or pop-up approach. So telling people, well, this is temporary. If it doesn't work, or we can change it, or we can even take it out if necessary. But that's one way to overcome hesitancy and worry. And it's quite understandable that people have their worries. But going ahead and trying things is a very powerful approach. And I guess hopefully this can be a lasting legacy of COVID.
I was actually going to say there was an example in the Waverley Council area where alongside the beachfront, I think I mentioned the Bronte cutting earlier.
Yes.
There's around about 1 million people walk along the coastal walk every year.
Wow.
And in this particular location, there's about 6,000 on a weekend. You'll get about 6,000 pedestrians a day and about 600 cars. It was traditionally a tram route. I think that went in 110 years ago. There was a tram route that was put through that closed about 60 years ago, and it was turned over to essentially a one-way system with car parking on each side. So the council trialled, had to take out 21 Onstreet car parking bays, put it in as a temporary pilot or trial as a footpath. And after running a 3-year trial on that, they've now turned that into a permanent footpath that just opened last week. And I put it up on Twitter, and it's had a huge amount of interest in it and a huge amount of support. Everyone's saying this is just, why didn't we do this earlier? But I think doing that pilot or temporary approach means that you can just test it live with the community. You can get out there and ask them, well, now that we've put it in and you've tested it out and tried it, do you want to keep it? And if the community says, and I'd say you probably want to run those things for more than a couple of months, because you want people to get used to it. It's different to business as usual. But after a period of time, then go back and ask them, well, what would you like us to do? Do you want us to return it to what it was, or do you want to keep it as like this and make it permanent?
Yes.
I think that's a really good way to test with the community where there is a significant change and it could be controversial.
It changes the dynamic of the conversation so much when the existing situation is already the change. That's very powerful. Thank you so much. I think this was a really hopeful conversation, and some of the lessons from the experience of Waverley and also of Sydney with the bicycle lanes at the end. Both of those stories had some powerful lessons that others can learn from. Sydney is far from the international leader in sustainable transport, but there are some amazingly positive things happening, and it's heading in the right direction, I think, by the sounds of it, in many different ways.
I think it is, yes.
Thanks, Sarah. That was great.
You're welcome. That was fun.
You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.